Good evening and welcome to Tracking the Tropics, your weekly in-depth look at the hurricane season and how it will impact you. I'm CBS 17 Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein in Raleigh, North Carolina. Welcome to week 4 of the Atlantic hurricane season, where we have a new tropical storm and Saharan dust. But here's what else we have coming up on episode 4 of Tracking the Tropics.
Hi, I'm meteorologist Caroline Crithers here in Mobile, Alabama, and on tonight's show, we're going to be talking about the hurricane hunters. We're going to go through what they do to keep us safe, some interesting facts about their planes, and some of their craziest stories.
Hi, everybody. I'm Storm Tracker 8 Chief Meteorologist John Bernier here in Richmond, Virginia, in the Storm Tracker 8 HQ. Tonight, we're talking about how the hurricane hunters came to be, and believe it or not, a personal connection to them.
So we've got a theme tonight, Hurricane Hunter aircraft, for all you av geeks out there and weather nerds like myself and many other meteorologists who join us throughout the year. This show is for you. So the big news in the tropical world today was Tropical Storm Dolly formed. It's a few hundred miles off the coast of the East Coast, way out here, nearly in the open waters of the Atlantic, and the forecast path will continue to push it away. So obviously, at that position, there's no impact on the United States, but this was subtropical depression number 4. It acquired some tropical characteristics, and it also got a little bit stronger in the last 24 hours. So the Hurricane Center upgraded it to Tropical Storm Dolly earlier today. This is the 4th named storm, and this is the 3rd earliest we've ever had the D named storm. It has 45-mile-per-hour winds gusting up to 60. The pressure is a little bit above 1,000 millibars. And you know, pressure is not something that gets a lot of play, but when that pressure is above 1,000, you generally know it's not a strong enough storm to hold itself together. It's moving to the east-northeast at 12 miles per hour. And again, it's about 600 to 700 miles off the coast of the northeast United States. And when you get up that far to the north, you start to run into some cooler water. So it's nearly impossible for a hurricane or a tropical storm to hold itself together. Remember, one of the key ingredients you need for a tropical system to strengthen and maintain itself is 80-degree water. And when you get that far north, especially in June, there's not a lot of 80-degree water until you bring into play the Gulf jet stream. The Gulf Stream, excuse me. That is a current of water that really circles from the Gulf of Mexico around the tip of Florida, and it's a little river of warmer water that goes up the East Coast. Well, look at the historic path of where Tropical Storm Dolly has been, right over the Gulf Stream, right over that warm water. So in that sense, we can kind of make sense of the fact that this storm did strengthen. Now from here on out, it moves to some water that's not as warm. Pretty much anywhere you see the oranges, that's where you're getting close to 80 degrees and above. So for a while there, it was over some warm water. Now as it continues to move farther up to the northeast, it gets into cooler water. It's going to fall apart and lose all its energy. But over the past 24 hours, we have a closer look at Tropical Storm Dolly. You can see more or less a straight northeasterly path. But as you go through the last few hours, you can start to see that the convection, the thunderstorm activity that looked pretty impressive, kind of starts to fall apart right about the same time. You start to see a little more hint of a circulation. I'll let that run through one more time. Warm water, warm water, warm water, lots of thunderstorm activity, starting to move into cooler water, a little bit of a circulation, but the thunderstorm activity starts to fall apart. We actually expect this system to no longer be a tropical system on Wednesday, and then it'll be history, and just like that, we've gone through 4 named storms, and we're not even through the first full month of the Atlantic hurricane season. Elsewhere out in the tropics, boy, not a whole lot going on. That has a little bit to do with the time of year. You know, normally we don't have a lot of activity out here in the open waters of the Atlantic. Sure, some thunderstorms, but nothing organized. It also has a little bit to do with something you may have heard about this week, Saharan dust, African dust coming from the deserts of Africa. We're going to talk a lot more about that in just a few minutes. But as I said, Arthur, Bertha, Cristobal, and Dolly have all been checked off the list of 2020 hurricane storm names. And while I showed you there's really nothing else out there cooking right now, next up on the list, Eduard, Faye, and Gonzalo. All right, now on to our main topic this season, and tonight, as I said a little earlier, it's the Hurricane Hunter aircraft. They're based in two different spots in the United States, MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida, and Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi. And right down the road in Mobile, Alabama, is where we find WKRG meteorologist Caroline Carithers. She got to go one-on-one with one of the Hurricane Hunter pilots. And Caroline, tell us what you learned.
So I was just kind of talking to them about several different things. We talked about what the Hurricane Hunters do, and they actually have a couple of missions, but the main one is they fly into storms as they're developing, and they drop weather instruments, and they have weather instruments on their planes, and they just gather this information, send it directly to the National Hurricane Center. The National Hurricane Center puts them in their forecast models to really hone in on that cone of uncertainty that we all know. And so that's really their main mission, is just to get those observations back to the National Hurricane Center.
WC-130J. I think we started flying that model in about 1998 or 9 is when we got those. So it's a transport cargo aircraft, 4 engines, turboprop. It's a multifaceted kind of workhorse airplane of the Air Force. You could land it in Alaska on skis, in a short field desert in Afghanistan, and like we do, flying them in a hurricane. So it's a multi-role airplane. We have it reconfigured with the weather configuration. So we have 2 big pallets. They're kind of like big computer pallets, where we have a weather loadmaster and a weather officer who are releasing weather instruments and then collecting that data, which gets sent off to NHC. So the airplane itself, the only additional equipment on the plane is on the underside of the right wing. We have what's called a Smurf, and I won't get too much into that, but it basically is what it reads the surface winds and rainfall intensity. As well as inside the airplane, we have the actual tube where we drop the weather SON, and it's just a cylindrical tube with a parachute on it, about I think 16 inches long, 3.5 inches in diameter, and as it falls, it's collecting all that data, the wind speed, direction, temperature, pressure, humidity, all that stuff, and that drops all the way into the water. That information goes immediately up to the plane, to the loadmaster's computer. He collects that data and sends it 6 feet over to the weather officer in raw format, and the weather officer kind of cleans that data up, and then he ultimately sends that basically as almost like a text message from the plane to NHC.
So cool. Can you tell me kind of, I guess, the craziest or most intense story that you've had when flying into a hurricane or a tropical storm? Kind of what's the craziest thing that's happened?
So the strongest hurricane I flew was Hurricane Patricia. A lot of people might not remember Hurricane Patricia, but it was actually the strongest hurricane on the Western Hemisphere in the history of the Western Hemisphere since we've been recording hurricanes. It was, the winds were over 200 miles an hour, and on our way out there, it was, I believe, a Cat 2, and they told us that it was strengthening rapidly. And once I heard that, I know, okay, this is going to be a rough ride, because anytime a storm is strengthening, and especially if it's already a Cat 2, it's probably going to be a bumpy ride. And when we got there, it was a Cat 5. And actually, I think a Cat 5 starts at about 156 miles per hour. This was at 200 miles per hour. So extremely bumpy ride. And it was a little surprising because it was by far the bumpiest I'd had. And so we really had to, after that first pass in, the turbulence was so severe and so jarring that we really had the adrenaline going up after that first round. But kind of tied with, I was in the middle of a hurricane, we had a fuel leak, and I had to shut an engine down in the middle of the hurricane, make the decision to do that, because fuel leaks with lightning striking around and whatnot, and fuel leak in general is just not a good thing. So we had to fly out with one engine shut down, and that can be real tricky, and had never trained for that. And we have to jockey the power a lot, and that has a large effect on the airplane. So it was something very, it was new and unique, and something I'd never practiced. So I was pretty I was very awake for that one. I'll put it that way.
Wow. Caroline, the understatement of the year, flying into a storm with a fuel leak and lightning around is not a good thing. You've been down there and have talked to them on several occasions over the years. This is a strange question, but not that they have a choice. What kind of storms do they prefer to fly into when they're in the airplane?
Okay, so I've talked to 2 different pilots from the hurricane hunters, and they actually said given the choice between flying into a tropical storm or flying into a Category 5 hurricane, they'd pick the Category 5 hurricane any day. And I was kind of shocked to hear that because I wouldn't want to fly into a Category 5 hurricane, but they said just because Category 5 hurricanes are stable and they're developed and they're predictable, but they said tropical storms are still developing. So they're really unstable and they're really unpredictable. They said that they would definitely rather take that Category 5 hurricane on any day over a tropical storm.
Interesting. You know, it's a dangerous mission that the men and women from the U.S. Air Force take on. It's an expensive plane and upwards of $50 million, but they can also help our government save millions when a hurricane is approaching. Tell us a little bit about how they do that.
Yeah, so I said earlier they have a couple of missions. Of course, one is to fly into those storms and get those observations for the Hurricane Center. But the other mission that we talked about actually with the pilot that you just heard from is that they really coordinate with the people who make the decisions, emergency managers and the government about evacuations. And they were saying in certain spots, if you evacuate a certain amount, it could cost millions of dollars. So they're getting those observations and they know exactly what that storm is looking like, really from the bird's eye view, so they can help make those decisions with evacuations to potentially save the government and our country millions of dollars.
Yeah, and one of the last things on our mind in the middle of June is winter. But the hurricane hunters, they just don't get to vacation in the winter. They also play an important role in forecasting snow and ice and winter storms too, right?
Right. So I was talking to them and I was like, well, in your off season, they're like, off season? What are you talking about? They said they fly into winter storms and they're really only off month that they're not actively flying into storms is the month of March. And that's where they kind of prepare for hurricane season. And I even asked them, with the earlier start of hurricane season, it officially starts on June 1st, but we've been seeing for the past 6 years, things develop earlier. I said, does that really impact how early you start preparing? And they said, nope, we just prepare for the worst and hope for the best. So
no off season. There's the moral of that story for those of us who aspire to maybe do that one day. Good stuff, Caroline. Thanks so much for spending some time with us tonight. That's Caroline Carithers at WKRG in Mobile, Alabama. Now, one of the big weather stories across the country this week is Saharan dust. We'll get back to the hurricane hunters in just a second, but I want to show you this. This is a satellite image taken from above our planet earlier today, and you can tell it was late in the day because if you look on the right side of this satellite image, you see darkness. That is the sun setting. And what you see over here as we look over the Caribbean, there's Florida in the United States, the Caribbean Sea, there's South America, way over there back in the darkness is Africa. What you see here, this grayish, brownish hue, that is a picture from space of the Saharan dust. It traveled nearly 5,000 miles from Africa to Puerto Rico and the Caribbean earlier this week. Check this out, hazy gray skies, making it look almost like cloudy conditions were observed in Puerto Rico, especially in the island's mountainous areas. The dust has already resulted in much higher temperatures and is expected to remain in the Caribbean through at least the upcoming weekend. So then what? Well, then it heads to the Gulf of Mexico and on to the United States. And I'll show you the dust forecast in just a second. But I actually happen to have a friend who lives part of the year in Antigua. That's just on the outskirts of the Eastern Caribbean, kind of where the Atlantic Ocean and the Eastern Caribbean come together. It's one of the small islands. And this top view is before the dust arrived. And let's be honest, that's a typical shot that we all dream of while we're stuck in our cubicle during the day. Beautiful plants, beautiful blue sky, white puffy cumulus clouds until, look at the bottom image. This is what happened when the dust arrived just a couple days ago. And what does it look like? It looks cloudy. It looks like we've taken it into Photoshop and kind of toned down all the blues. That is the gray, hazy hue that many people see in the Caribbean when the dust arrives. Now, when it comes to the United States, there will be some impacts, but not like something you would see in the Mummy movie from 20 years ago. Not something you would think would come out of Hollywood. It's not going to be a haboob, something we see in the desert Southwest in the United States, but it could have some impacts that some of us will notice. Let's start with the Saharan dust forecast. And this is from our current position, where I just showed you the satellite picture, and you can see Tuesday night, look, the dust is over the Caribbean. So indeed, the forecast model lines up. That's always an important thing to check on. If the forecast model showed the dust still way out here, we really couldn't use it. So this is a pretty good, reliable Saharan dust forecast model. As we head into Thursday afternoon, so in about 48 hours, that dust will spread into the Gulf of Mexico and start to overspread our friends from Texas all the way to the Florida Gulf Coast. From there, as we head into Friday, believe it or not, this dust could actually spread up into the Midwest. This is Saturday morning, Friday night. So Friday into Saturday, and then as we go into Saturday afternoon, it starts to push across into the mountains on the East Coast. And then as we get into Saturday night and Sunday afternoon, you can see that dust starts to spread over the mid-Atlantic. So kind of a menacing shot, both with the pictures we saw, the thought of what's been happening in 2020, and now what do we have to deal with? We have to deal with Saharan dust. Well, listen, this is something that happens every year. It's probably getting a little more attention this year given what's going on in our world. And the intensity of the dust is probably a little higher than it normally is. But here's what we can expect in the United States as it arrives later this week. One thing to keep in mind, this dust that we've been looking at from space is probably about 1 to 2 miles above us on the surface. So it's not like we're going to be breathing in mass amounts of dust or your car is going to be covered in it. It's way up there in the atmosphere, but it will still provide hazy gray skies. And it could have some minor impacts if you have some very sensitive respiratory issues, or maybe you're really sensitive to allergies. Could have some minor impacts, but most of us won't know it. You won't go outside and smell it. You won't go outside and breathe it in and start coughing. It's not going to be that. What it will do is dry out the atmosphere, maybe help raise the temperature, give us lower rain chances. We really like it this time of year because it reduces hurricane activity. And one of the benefits that I'm looking forward to, with all the particulate matter in the sky, again, way up there, it's going to provide some amazing colors during sunrise and sunset time. So make sure you add that to your calendar. Check that out as we head into the weekend. All right, next up tonight, we're going to head up to Richmond, Virginia, where we find WRIC Storm Tracker 8 Chief Meteorologist John Bernier. John, we're going to get back on the topic of hurricane hunters, and you have a personal story to share with us later. But let's start with how in the world someone decided a long time ago it was a good idea to fly an airplane into a hurricane. Share with us some of the history.
Well, all right, some of the history with this, and it takes you back to World War II. Believe it or not, before World War II, there was a thought of let's use airplanes to kind of look and find where these storms were. But in 1943, Colonel Joe Duckworth, on a bet, flew a Army Air Corps plane into a hurricane down in the Gulf of Mexico, and he actually went in twice and survived. People thought, maybe he's gone a little crazy, but he did that. So it proved the possibility of doing that. But really, we go back to World War II in the Pacific Ocean. You remember the hurricane hunters? They were talking about Hurricane Patricia, which was in the Pacific, the worst storm that they went into. Pacific, notorious for having stronger storms in the Atlantic. Hurricane Patricia, by the way, those of you who've ever heard a guy named Josh Morgerman, he goes by the moniker Ice Cyclone. He was actually videographing. He's a hurricane chaser, like a tornado chaser, was actually videoing that storm when it made landfall in Mexico. But what happened in World War II, typhoons in the Western Pacific played a significant role in what was going on with the Third Fleet, part of the United States Navy. And this is where we started getting into the thought of, maybe we need to start chasing these things down and doing a little bit of reconnaissance on them. So let's go into some of the graphics here that I want to show you. I'm going to take you back to what happened 1944, December, off the island of Luzon. That's over in portions of the Philippines. And this is Halsey's Typhoon, the Third Fleet, which was the most powerful portion of the United States Navy, ends up literally going into the center of Typhoon Cobra. This is December of 1944. 3 destroyers sink. And the reason why they sank, and anybody who knows anything about boating, is these ships were running low on fuel. So they were riding high and they capsized. So it was the USS Hull, the USS Monaghan, and the USS Spence. What you're seeing over there in the picture is actually one of the Independence class light carriers. I think that might be the San Jacinto. And that shows you how far it was rolling over in the storm. So there are 27 other ships sustained damage and 779 men died as a result. And there were all kinds of big investigations into this. And actually, Admiral Bill Halsey was kind of faulted as a result of this for basically steaming into the storm. Well, sure enough, go 6 months later, we got another problem. And by the way, this storm, this typhoon, was the second time that the eye of a tropical system was actually seen on radar. This is one of the radars they use to track planes and track oncoming ships, and they'll actually see the eye of the storm. So we take you now to June, 75 years ago, 1945, you go into the South China Sea. Again, the Third Fleet, at least part of it, ends up in the center of Typhoon Connie. Not as much damage because it was only about a quarter of the fleet that was caught with this. We didn't see any ships getting sunk, but the USS Pittsburgh right there had the bow of the ship actually snap off of it and float away. Now, the bow got recaptured and was basically a ship took it in tow, found it and started, hooked some tow lines onto it and started bringing it back to port. And you can see the Pittsburgh there at Guam afterwards, and they were able to reattach the bow. A little bit of humor in there. The captain of the destroyer that found it sent a rather humorous message when he said, "I have found McKeesport and taken it in tow." And McKeesport is a suburb of Pittsburgh, i.e. the part of the ship being a suburb. This one only here, they had 33 ships sustain damage, but only 6 people unfortunately perished as a result of this. So they lost some aircraft, 76, but it was half as many as were lost in Typhoon Cobra. So bad, but not horrible. So after this, the thought was we need to start using airplanes to track these storms down. So Pacific's very vast. Typhoons in the Pacific tend to be much stronger than the Atlantic. So the initial planes that we started to use for this were planes that were doing duty in World War II. So they weren't built specifically to fly into these type storms. They were built for reconnaissance. They were built for bombing missions. They used the B-29 Superfortress, which was flying out of the Marianas and out of China. That's the plane, the Enola Gay, that was used to drop the atomic bomb 75 years ago this August. They also used the Navy P-4Y, which is a Liberator search plane that was used to fly into these storms. Unfortunately, because these storms weren't specifically built, we started to have some casualties as a result of this. We lost some planes as we went through. So we've got right here, the first one, PB-4Y, Navy plane, Category 1 typhoon, October 1st, 1945. That's over the South China Seas, off the coastline, as you can see, of Vietnam, losing 6 out of the 7 crew members. Then we go into 1952, a WB-29, which is a B-29 bomber that was set up to use for weather reconnaissance, flies in the Super Typhoon Wilma. Or Super Typhoon is the typhoon terminology for a Category 5 hurricane. All 10 members of the crew were lost. And then another Navy PBY, this is in the 1950s, flies into Super Typhoon Doris. 9 crew members are lost. Now, you notice these are all in the Pacific. We've only lost 1 in the Atlantic, and that was a Navy P-2 Neptune. That was in 1955. 9 Navy sailors and 2 Canadian journalists were lost in this off the coastline of Central America. That's the only one lost in the Atlantic. We go back in the Pacific, we lose another one in the 1950s, January 15, 1958. Another WB-29 flies into Super Typhoon Ophelia. Again, the equivalent of a Category 5 storm. 9 crew members are lost. Then we have almost a 20-year gap until 1974. The WC-130 Hercules, which is what we use now, was one of the first ones. 6 crew members lost. That's the only plane of the type that's currently used right now that actually we have lost, and that was almost 46 years ago. So you can see the WC, which is the same thing as the AC-130, the AC-130, the gunship, the C-130 that the military airlift command uses, AKA they're known as the trash haulers nickname, and their motto is "You call, we haul." My college roommate through his military career was a trash hauler that went through there. So that was all involving what happened through. Now, the interesting thing is, we said this involved the Navy. The early start of this, of the hurricane hunters, was kind of a little ad hoc and a little, we started doing this. It really wasn't a super formalized organization until we got later on after World War II, and especially into the 1950s. And this is kind of where my connection to the hurricane hunters comes in. It's not 6 degrees of separation, but 1. So let's talk about how this came about. And it came about actually from doing some broadcasting, not here in the United States, but overseas. So for about 10 years, I was part of a program on BBC Radio known as Extreme World Weather. And we did this for 10 years. It was BBC Radio Devon. We had myself, David Brain, who at one time was the Ginger Z, John Coleman of BBC Weather. He now actually does weather in southwestern portions of England and Plymouth. And Vic Morgan, who kind of was the ringleader of all of this and tried to keep us all. And we had a show that was on bi-weekly, talking about all kinds of weather that was going on around the world. And we got a couple other things. Vic's a huge Red Sox fan like myself. So 10 years ago, I'm over visiting my father with my son before my son moves overseas. And did the show from all over the world. I've done it from overseas. I've done it from here. I was doing it from my father's house in New England. And we were talking about Hurricane Otto and Hurricane Paula. And just going over the fact, the hurricane hunters are flying into these storms. Here's what they're seeing and all this other stuff, which led to a really interesting conversation involving my father and airplanes. So my father at the time was 84 years old. There's a picture of him when I took him to the Bahamas for his 81st birthday. That's him in a merengue contest, and he won it, of all things. But after we all got done with this, my father said, "You were talking about the planes that fly into hurricanes." I used to do that after the war, meaning World War II. So what happened was, my father joined the Navy in 1944 at the age of 18. And was a crew dog on a variety of planes, especially the TBF Avenger, and also PBYs and PB4Ys, and also after the war on test and reconfigured planes. He was stationed at Corpus Christi and Brownsville, and there's a picture of him in his Navy uniform. He's in the middle in the picture that you see here, and he's also going to show up in the picture down the bottom as he's on the left. So during World War II, he hunted submarines, mainly in the Gulf of Mexico. Furthest he got out in the Pacific Ocean was he was on his way out to the far western Pacific, out towards the Philippines, to do submarine hunting out there. Actually got orders an hour out of San Diego to fly back to the Gulf of Mexico to help hunt hurricanes. Well, after the war, he basically said, this is what we would do. We would fly out into storms to find out where they were and measure the barometric pressure from all of these. And that's what he did during the post-war period as hurricane reconnaissance was first getting started. And this was something I didn't find out about until 52 years later. And when we left the Navy, he actually had a certificate from one of the commanding officers of the Air Base declaring him an honorary lieutenant commander in the Navy. He was enlisted, as you can see by his uniform. So that's kind of highlighted the whole thing of how this all kind of come back full circle, where, I'm the broadcast meteorologist. And as it turns out, unbeknownst to me, my father may have been one of the original hurricane hunters.
Wow, interesting story. And thank you to your dad for his service. John, I got to ask you, both of us and meteorologists all over the country talk to a lot of groups and a lot of schools, and this subject of hurricane hunters may come up. One of the most popular questions I get, and it's a little morbid, is, how come more of these planes don't crash, or has there ever been a crash? I mean, how is it that they can be so safe? I mean, we've got the best men and women in the world up front from the Air Force flying these things. They're really well built. They take a lot of safety precautions. Are you surprised that it's been, what'd you say, 40 or 50 years since we've had a major incident?
We're going on 46 years. It'll be 46 years this fall. I'm actually very surprised. As they told you, though, they've had damage. I think, I want to go back, I believe Hurricane Fran was a storm in which one of the planes went in and had lost 2 of its engines and they actually had another WC-30 fly into the storm. So they had two planes inside the storm, and they used the first one actually kind of became the pathfinder for the second one to fly out. So it was looking for a weak spot in the storm to do so. And a lot of times we've gotten reports, they've said, they've had really rough rides today with this. And a lot of it's in developing storms, not storms that are fully mature. We go back to the 1980s, Hurricane Gilbert, or Gilbert, if you want to use the French pronunciation for it, which went south of Cuba. Actually, inside this eye of the storm at that time, there were actually three planes flying around inside the eye. There was the Hurricane Hunters. There was the NOAA P3 Orion that comes out of MacDill, where, by the way, if you've been following the news, some of the staff members there apparently have been inflicted by the coronavirus. And there was also, at that time, a Soviet plane, of course, coming out of Cuba, was kind of like flying in a storm and seeing what was going on. They said the good part about all that is all three of us were talking to each other, so we could all stay away from each other's, flight paths and stuff. But yeah, it is amazing at how well built that C-130 plane is, and how much essentially punishment it can take inside those storms.
Yeah, and we're very glad. I mean, it saves a lot of people's lives, and it saves millions of dollars every year. And better them than us. I think I'm pretty happy here on the ground, but we're very happy that they do that for us. Yeah. And thanks for sharing your dad and your family history with us, as well as teaching us a little bit about the history of the Hurricane Hunter. That's John Bernier up in Richmond, Virginia. Until next time, my friend. All right, that's it for us. Thank you for spending part of your night tracking the tropics with us. We'll be here every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern throughout the Atlantic hurricane season. Live in Raleigh, North Carolina, I'm Wes Hohenstein.